the negotiation rooms. Uh, Sometimes we tend to forget what's actually happening here at COP28 in Dubai. This is a negotiation setting. This is where the multilateral process to deal with climate change is actually happening. I was lucky enough to be in Paris in 2015 to see, one would say, all of this starting. That's not really true. It started like almost 20 years before Paris, but we like to think of Paris as the start of this process. And already there was a sense of urgency. Already there, 1.5 was the red line for many countries, in particular small island developing states. I mean, fast forward 8 years, 2023, that sense of urgency should be multiplied for 100,000. I feel that sense of urgency is not really felt in, it is, but it's not in these rooms and in the negotiations. I don't want to go too catastrophic, but I have heard saying we are looking into the climate abysm and all those kind of words. But I do think it's important to put from a regulatory perspective. Uh, Often people say that in order to do things well, you need time, you need data, you need to collate data, you need to collect capacity building. And I'm all for it when you have time. We don't have time. People in the room, people online will know much better than me the amazing capabilities and future of solar power, and in particular floating solar. And I don't doubt it for a minute. Having said that, regulation often has been developed both at international level, but in more in particular at domestic level, for another energy, not even cycle, era. I wouldn't say it was a dinosaur area, but to some extent it was. Even in the country I live, the UK, a lot of the regulation has been thought with oil, coal, and gas, not with floating solar. And a lot of the problems that, and this is my other point, communities who actually rely on the electricity provided through solar, floating solar, or even not floating solar, are frustrated, even in the UK, because they don't see the benefits of this renewable energy for their day-to-day livelihood. So this puts me to put forward to you and to those online two key messages, which I hope can be developed throughout the day. First is that we need to act with urgency. We need to act with urgency. We need to develop regulatory frameworks that are tailored to the technology, to, in this case, floating solar. We may have to do it with not the specific and precise and fantastic perfect data that we would want to. We need to find a regulation that is flexible enough to increase that data whilst we start pushing that technology as fast as we can. And the problem with that is that nobody will be happy. Probably the users, the utilities, the governments, will not be 100% happy, but we just have to deal with that. That's the first point. The second point, actually, I have three. The second point is about the communities. So I have had the pleasure to work with, and I'll give you this example, with a company, environmental services based in Orkney, one of the archipelagos, one of the group of islands in Scotland called Aquaterra. They have worked a lot on floating solar over the last 10 years in the Philippines and in Indonesia at a very community level. And what they always tell me, again, not rocket science to be honest, but it's important to emphasize it, that in the projects they have been involved, the scale of success was always commensurate to the engagement of the island community. I believe that even when it comes to the regulation, to the deployment of the technology, you can, any aspect of it, and in particular, especially, for example, the waste, the recycling, and so forth, unless the island community is empowered there's a huge risk of this going bad. How you engage the community, there's not one solution for all. This becomes very culturally context. The way I would try to engage with a community in a small island in Scotland will be obviously completely different to the way Philippine stakeholders would do it in the Philippines and Indonesia. But people, utilities, from the highest investor possible to the local NGO that maybe deals with them on a daily basis, needs to come together to do that. The problem with this is number one, we need to do it fast. And obviously, just as regulation, even community engagement does need time. You need to build that trust. But had we done things faster from 2015, maybe we would have been in a better situation. We don't have that time. We need to act fast. But we cannot just jump the community participation. The third aspect, and this links to my work with IUCN, is the marine and land biodiversity. Okay, let's go floating. Let's just put floating solar panels on all the lagoons of the world and turn on the lights. No, clearly not. I mean, let's not do that. And it's again common sense, but let's emphasize that. Yes, let's move towards climate action. Let's make the world a better place. Let's move fast. But at the same time, there's also nature that needs to be our ally rather than be the victim. And with IUCN, as you kindly suggested, well, indicated, I am leading a project called Islands Nature Renewable Energy Law Project, collaboration with a university in Australia, Macquarie University, and a research center on carbon storage in Spain, but very much linked to IUCN and IUCN's wider efforts on renewable energy and nature. And really, there, what we're looking at is country driven projects that look at regulatory approaches, very much what we're doing here, that yes, promote renewables, in this case, floating solar, but not only undermining marine and land biodiversity, but as where possible, even fostering marine and land biodiversity, putting the people, number two, the people at the heart of decision making. So if anybody in the room or online wants to know more, please do reach out to me. I'll be happy to talk to them about that. So wrapping up, first point, there's a massive urgency in front of us. We all know it. Sometimes we forget it because, there's just 110,433 people around us here in Dubai. But actually, this is really, really, really important. Regulation has to happen. It has to happen before the technology is deployed, because if not, how in the earth are you going to deploy it in the proper way? But on the other hand, we don't have a luxury of 10, 15 years to develop regulation. We literally, in some cases, have to do it in a matter of months, which is a challenge. Two, in that challenge of time and regulation, we need to engage with the local communities. And three, we need to engage with the local communities. We need to do regulation fast, but also fostering marine and land biodiversity. I'll leave it to that. I hope you have a great day, a great conversation. I do apologize. I will have to leave at 11 for another side event, but thank you so, so much for the invitation.
Thank you, Dr. Sindiko. I think you've set the context for the session beautifully, and emphasizing the urgency of actually doing the regulations is something that even at ISA we really believe that needs to be set up, because when we're talking about deploying these technologies without regulation, they're not scalable. Second, they're very uncertain. So that is why we thought the session was important, and you've done that beautifully to explain that for our audience today. Um, Today, in the panel discussion, we will explore the regulatory barriers that exist to this technology, floating solar. If there are any barriers, what are they, and how probably we can, what are the potential solutions that we can do to address those regulatory barriers? And without further ado, I would like to invite the panelists for today. First will be Dr. Mauro, who is the Senior Director for Floating Voltaics at the Technology Innovation Institute. Dr. Mauro got his PhD from the Imperial College London. He is an IAC expert for floating solar modules for TC82, with whom he has been liaising for more than 10 years. He is a member of the British Society for the Philosophy of Science and ISO 17025 technical assessor for NATA, the Australian National Agency for Testing Authorities. From 2017 to 23, he was with the National University of Singapore, directing the PV module cluster at SIERS, Singapore's National Research Institute for Solar Energy. Since 2018, he is a member of the International Scientific Community of NEC conferences. We welcome you, Dr. Mauro. Next, we have Miss Ava, who will be joining us online. She's the group head of public affairs and the vice chair for Global Solar Council, and will be joining us virtually. As the group head of public affairs, she elaborates and operates as influence strategy to influence strategy and highlight the implementation of Amrico's unique vision associating regeneration of ecosystems for solar powered infrastructure to all its markets. As the chair of the Agri Solar Workstream of Solar Power Europe, um, land use and permitting workstream, she promotes synergies between agriculture and solar sectors. To tackle climate change, adaptation, and stands for ecological transition, promoting regenerative agricultural solutions combined with solar energy production in rural areas. We have Mr. Siddharth Nath. Who works with Masdar as the business development and investments manager. He is at Mazda. He spearheads their developmental activities in Asia Pacific regions. His responsibilities span from deal generation to achievement of financial close for of potential investments for Masdar, and key focus areas being stakeholder and shareholder management, project structuring, negotiations, offtake, EPC, O&M, and financing contracts, and balancing the risk versus reward equation. We also have Mr. Mohammed from DNV. He's the area manager Middle East. He'll be joining us virtually today, and he is the economist and area manager focused on energy transition. Over the years, he has successfully positioned DNV as the leading energy transition advisory, supporting multiple high impact projects in MEA, and has a specific focus in UAE and KSA. He regularly contributes to thought leadership, attends high level forums, and frequently contributes to various publications. I welcome you all, and I'd request our in person panelists, Dr. Mauro and Siddharth, to please come and join us at the stage. So I think I think what would be interesting for maybe the viewers here is that we have somebody from Masdar, which is essentially a developer. And when we talk about regulations, it's often looked at as being not so much in favor of the developer, or maybe there might be some resistance that um, is often looked at, or maybe some people assume that there may be some resistance from developer. So the idea of getting you here actually was so that you could talk about you could tell us about the Chirata floating solar project that Mazda recently completed and inaugurated uh, in Indonesia, and what according to you is how do you make a sustainable project like how do you sustainably structure a project um, to, of course, as I mentioned, to make it sustainable? And what do you think is the role regulations play in it?
Uh, Hi, everyone. Very good morning. Thank you to ISA for having me here. So, see, you have to understand for floating solar specifically, the part of the technology or some as technology as some of the parts by itself is not old. What's unique for floating solar is that every location, every site is vastly different uh, in a very unique manner. It can be on a lake, it can be on a reservoir of a dam, it can be near shore of a coast, can be further away. Each each of those locations or types of installations vary vastly from each other, uh, be it uh, from technical perspective or a design perspective, be it from an environmental and social perspective. Uh, However, so that's one part of the challenge in standardizing the regulations. It's the way as developers we look at it. One, we prefer the word challenges to barriers. Very honestly, barriers at times tends to have a certain negative connotation to it. When we did the Chirata floating solar plant, so this is in Indonesia, it's just shy of 200 megawatts. I think outside of China and Southeast Asia, this is one of the larger installations that we have. So there are broadly three regulatory challenges. One is on the economies of scale, uh, which translates into one, the nature of the water body. Is the water body used for fresh water for a country or the region, or it's a dam or a reservoir like Chirata, which does also hydropower generation on the site? Uh, that also translates into the quantum of the surface of the water body that you can actually use to generate power. So Indonesia, when they did the first plant, limited uh, the floating panels to 5% of the lake area. You may ask why 5? The intent was very clear. Put the plant up, understand the real impact that the plant actually has uh, on the neighborhood, on the community, and on the marine ecology around. Towards completion, they have now we've seen regulatorily given a nod to actually go up to 20% of the area. When you look at what Malaysia is doing, Malaysia differing on state to state allows you something between 20% to 40%. India, I think, does not limit it as a percentage, but says as long as you get a full environmental clearance, not an initial study, a full clearance, and we'll sign off to what they sign off. So that's one challenge that you see, uh, which is how big a plant can you put, which also translates into how cheap the electricity can be, and so on. The second is, of course, the marine and eco life, the ESG part of it. Um, it's not just marine life, but also the people whose livelihood depends on that lake or that reservoir. It can be tourism, it can be fish farming. I think it's important to take into account the impact of having a plant and moving or changing their sources of income and so on. And the third, of course, is the technical rules, regulations, and standardizations, which I think Mazdar and DNV did a lot of work during the Chirota plant. They were our technical advisors, and I can very proudly say that the regulations that we worked with on the plant actually have been adopted by the Indonesian government as a guide for future floating solar installations in the country. So they benchmark the project against Chirata for new installations that will come. So I think these are the three challenges that we see and that are important for developing sustainable plants.
Thank you so much, Siddharth, and congratulations on this, engagement with Indonesia to actually assist. I mean, indirectly assist them with even looking at regulations that they could potentially adopt. So congratulations on that, and I'm glad that we have somebody from DNV also who'd be bringing in their perspective, maybe a little bit of Chirata and otherwise the other work that they've done as well. Before I move to actually, DNV, I'd actually move to Eva, who can maybe provide us with the European perspective of um, what are the challenges. I won't use the word barriers as you mentioned. What are the challenges that are hindering investments in floating solar in the European market? She has been involved in developing the guidelines for floating solar, so I'm sure she'll have tons of things to say for us. Over to you, Eva.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. From Paris, actually. I propose to share the slide presenting the floating PV based practices guidelines we just released last week as Sustainable Europe. I don't know if you can share. I have 3, 4 slides to present.
Yes, we can see them now.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. If you can go straight forward to the slide 5. Yeah, 5 and 6. Anyway, you can stay on the 6. The idea is to first bring some numbers and figures on the potential on floating PV, and even if a specific regulatory framework was not set for FPV, you will see we had an absolute increase this market. So in 2015, the floating PV market, both on and offshore, was considered a niche segment, as installation levels remain below 100 megawatts worldwide. However, the emergence of new markets in Southeast Asia first, and the unlocking of flooded mining sites in China unleashed the exponential spirit of floating solar. Then from 2015 to 2017, the cumulative installed capacity of floating PV grew by more than 700%, from 70 megawatts to almost 600 megawatts. As of September 2018, that figure had grown more than 104 to 1.1 gigawatt, experiencing a nearly doubling of capacity relative to 2017. And in 2022 alone, 2.3 gigawatt was installed globally, reaching a 5.7 gigawatt of accumulating capacity. In Europe, currently, there are around 451 megawatts of grid-connected floating solar, mostly located in Netherlands. The country's floating PV capacity could grow even larger if its massive 2 gigawatt pipeline materializes over the coming years. So you see the expansion of this market has been very huge those past years. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as we do at Solar Power Europe, I have the privilege to chair the land use and permitting work stream at Solar Power Europe. We first released the agri-solar best practices. We want to promote dual use of land approaches, because we know that artificialized land, urban area, rooftop, solar car parks won't be enough to achieve our objective and to accelerate as it was duly presented. So we need to go on non-artificial land, on natural land. But you know that we have to decarbonate, but now we have also to restore ecosystem and biodiversity, because the worst scenario happening today is biodiversity loss. So what we do at this work stream is promoting a use approach, how to go on agricultural land, how to go on water bodies. But of course, we have to respect to integrate nature, biodiversity, and to do it in a right way, following best practices. So this report aims to drive high quality floating PV projects by creating and strengthening floating PV knowledge sharing across wider stakeholder groups. What we observed is more than regulation, I would say, and I'm a jurist. If we need to accelerate, we need to simplify procedure. Permitting procedure are already there for ground-mounted PV. The 450 megawatts that we are developing in Europe, we are developing in the context without specific regulatory framework to date. So it was able to develop anyway. Most important, I think we observe now is a need for rising knowledge, because I observe that also in regulatory framework for other more standards PV market, let's say, that at the end, the local community, the local policymaker taking the decision, even with a text, are not able to accelerate, are not able to take the right decision, are a bit confused. So now our action is really to raise the knowledge locally, to help local policymaker to take the right decision. So we need to communicate, and this kind of report we hope could be a support and help for that. So I will finish with next slide, please. Yeah, so a bit a glimpse of challenges of this sector, mostly on sustainability and environmental impact and issue as we are going on water, and water scarcity is also one of the major topic of days. So we need to be first, we need to identify the potential impacts of the floating solar system on the environment. So most of those solar assets start with an environmental impact assessment. The main issue observed is that floating PV could limit water exchange that may lead to a stratification of the temperatures and oxygen. If there is less oxygen dissolved in the water, this can bring death for the fauna. Okay, so water exchange, water exchange. Then floating PV creates shade under the water surface that may limit the penetration of light in the water and have consequences for photosynthesis and the algae growth and phytoplankton development, which are necessary for marine life. Also, third point, most of the floating PV use HDPE floaters, and some of floaters are using bad quality plastic. This has to be avoided absolutely. The long exposure to sun and water could lead to leaching of chemicals such as phenolic compounds in the water after a few years. We also the corrosion of metal, which is also a topic for marine water. For ponds, floating PV could impact avian species, especially water-feeding birds, by reducing their habitat and hunting territory, reducing their food access. Finally, still sometimes using detergents to clean panel, which is causing pollution in the water. And as it was mentioned, that can be conflict with local community, in particular fisherman community. So what are the solutions and good practices that exist to make floating PV sustainable? First, floating PV should not cover all the water surface. The best example we are presenting in the guide, the best case study are covering no more than 50% of the water body surface, and most of them 30% should be a good ratio, limited ratio to facilitate the exchange between water and oxygen. Second, the coverage ratio should be limited during the phase of design by deploying several smaller islands instead of a big one covering the surface. So we also have this kind of example. Third, avoid quality floaters. Only 100% HDPE certified, no recycled plastic should be used to avoid the to be used to avoid the pollution of plastic. Then create platforms in and around the floating islands where the birds can take refuge. Finally, forbid the use of detergents, and authorities must have clear public hearings to explain the project to local communities and engage them. That's why I was insisting on the fact that sharing knowledge and communication are really key in the success of this kind of asset. We can just finish with the next slide to base some of the best examples that we find developed in Europe currently. And you can see that we have onshore and also offshore, which is more technically challenging, but of course also easy in access to land because it's bigger areas, and the sector is really dynamic in inventing a new solution. Thanks.
Uh, Thank you, Eva. I think you beautifully highlighted the issues that, or the challenges that floating solar faces. And one of the key points being, or rather, let me say, the three key points that I got from your PowerPoint presentation was, one is regarding the environmental concerns that surround floating solar. Second is regarding, the use of bad quality material to actually make floaters or other components of floating solar. And the third is about community engagement and how it is so essential to ensure that communities understand the impact it may create on their lives, and on not only like yeah, impact and the benefit that it generates for them as well. So maybe a bit of both. um, I think what becomes crucial in such a what becomes crucial in this is standardizing what is the kind of equipment you would be using, what is the kind of cleaning material that you would be using, how how what would be the required measures that a company or any project developer needs to meet. And I think maybe Dr. Mauro would be best placed to kind of talk about what is the role of standards in promoting new technologies, as he works with the IEC on developing developing standards for floating solar at present. So.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, it is a topic which follows up naturally from Eva's presentation, and I believe she very cleverly listed a set of requirements that need to be standardized so that the community, uh, manufacturers, resource centers can all cooperate in one direction and address the concerns that Eva pointed out, and possibly other concerns that can come in the future in the right way. Now, on your question on how does the standard help to develop a new technology? Well, we have an history, of course, of standardization that dates back since whatever beginning of 20th century or so, in which I like to say that standards, serve as a minimum two big players, right? One is the industry. So the industry requires standards. Think about not only I mean, of course, the one, a guy that want to set up an industry to enter the market and produce solar modules for floating because he sees the potential market opportunities, needs to know accurately what are the rules, what are the standard practice, that the standard qualification processes, the safety regulation that are agreed internationally and that the product need to fulfill. So surely the industry requires standards. I like to say that the standards are made for the industry, right, not for resource centers. But on the other side, clearly standards are also needed from the end user, so from the developers like Mazda, or from the agencies, and from the owners of the land or the house. In this case, of course, it's mostly it's governmental or local communities, because they need to have documented, right. What are the practice, what are the qualification regulations that the product they want to install need to fulfill, at least in an international agreement. That would be the perfect idea, so that we don't have any mismatch between country where the modules are produced and the countries where the modules are installed. So standards serve both these sides of the story. I want to give an example because I know it's I know maybe nice to see for the general audience somehow. The example is on something we all have, right? Which is basically the smartphone. So it's just an example, right? So when you buy a smartphone, this is rather new. It's very nice to see, right? When you buy it, because in this case, because you like it, also because you know it, you make something for you. So there are a lot of needs and whatever. But then you like it, and therefore, yes, I buy it. And this is rather new. I didn't protect it uh, because it's new, right? Then I have another one, so that my mobile. Oh yeah, thank you. Oh, I think I do it. Yeah, that's my personal one, which is hyper protected. And of course, if you compare the two, this is not as nice as the other. Then why did I protect it? Because of course, day one I dropped it. And when I dropped it, it broke the glass. And when the glass is broken, it's no longer nice. So what is the standard benefit the end user here? I mean, clearly, I must say that probably when I bought it, the guy who sold it to me told me, "Hey, you need to also buy a cover, right?" And why don't you promote it with the cover? Because that's exactly what I'm going to buy, not only the smartphone itself. It doesn't look the same, isn't it? So the standard moved to the solar world and to solar modules in particular, literally should go in the direction in which when you buy something, you know what you buy, you know the risks that you take, and you know how robust is this to go in the environment. I think you can go later on talking about a particular case of floating. But at the moment, we know that when you put modules on water, it's clearly different than when you put a module on land, and that creates a set of problems at the module level alongside the problem at the system level that Eva mentioned previously, that we need all to address in the community, and particularly raise at the international community level, at the IEC level, where I'm honored to be an expert and a member, so that we prepare the module manufacturers to make products that are better and better, and the end user to be to be sure enough of the reliability of that product. Let me conclude one another comment on this topic, um, and that probably related to what Professor Francesco mentioned at the beginning. So true, we need to act fast, but that is a lot of responsibility that goes back to research centers like mine, both my previous one at Ceres and my current one in TII in Abu Dhabi, because uh, it's the industry on solar, also thanks to organizations like yours, are moving very fast. So I think we are doing our job, but and it's very fast. But we also need to be very fast in make sure that the modules are robust and reliable. You all hear very, in another, totally another topic in solar, all these fantastic results of perovskite, right? I mean, very high efficiency, 30%, maybe even 40% whenever in the future. But 30% that last one month is nothing. It's not what we are looking at. We need 20% that last 25 years is much better, right? So we need reliability, we need safety, and that's why the standard is important for that.
Thank you, Dr. Mauro. I think your example for with the phone, being from the legal profession and not so much understanding the technical aspects, really gives me an understanding of why we need standards and how it can um, help with, as an end user, understanding what I'm buying. Maybe a side campaign could be to actually sell products with what additional accessories we'd be requiring. That could be a side initiative we could launch. Coming back to the discussion that we have, we also have Dr. Mohammed, Mohammed from DNV, who will, who's worked, as Siddharth mentioned, on the Chirata project very closely. DNV's worked on that, and they've also published the recommended practice for floating solar power plants. Um, I wanted to understand from you, Mohammed, maybe based on these experiences that you've had, um, and of course, drawing in from what Dr. Mauro said, that we need standardization. Another aspect that we have to also look at is the permitting and the licensing of it. Because at the end, unlike say a land-based solar project where things are more clearer and also the stakeholders involved may be lesser, here we're talking about floating solar where a particular water body, which is probably the livelihood for many, is also going to get affected. So, what would be your opinion on, say, the permitting and licensing procedures, and your experience with the Chirata solar project as well?
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me onto this panel, and I'm really sorry I couldn't be with you today in person. Yeah, it's been an interesting discussion so far, and I think I'm very happy to have listened to the my previous panelists, and I think a lot of details have already been expressed. I think Eva really went into some finer details actually, which was quite good. So the recommended practice and our experience based on Chirata, which yeah, obviously congratulations to Master for that. I believe it's the biggest floating solar facility in the world. So that's a real achievement. Um, So the recommended practice, it was born out of a joint industry project of around 24 participants, and is, I think, less than or around 2 years old. And it's there to be, it's a functional guide. So in technical aspects and design aspects, yes, we've got some very specific um, parameters there. But when it comes to permitting, obtaining licenses, etc., by default, you are beholden to the legal and regulatory framework on each and every jurisdiction which you try to initiate a project in. However, in spite of this, we still can apply a framework to manage the risks of licensing, permitting, etc. And in some cases to help develop the framework, because it's new in many areas. As you said in your preamble, perhaps it's a lot more, the process is a lot more clearer for land-based installations, where actually a lot of the technical checks are very similar in terms of the process that we take, whether it's energy yield, whether it's structures and everything. You take quite a similar approach. But I would say that we apply a framework where, let's start with, I'll just summarize very broadly the principles. So if we start with building permits, here it's slightly more complex because you're not just looking at land, but you're looking at building on or utilizing the surface of a particular pool of water. I mean, it could be a lake, it it could be reservoir, it could be within an industrial zone. So even within a country, within a jurisdiction, depending on the type of facility you're looking at, you're going to have to make sure that whether it's national regulations, whether it's local permitting, uh, you may have a difference between a lake/reservoir versus an industrial zone in terms of which authorities you have to approach. But in a broad brush sense, you're looking for a building permit and you're looking for planning permission in whichever location you're looking to have the facility. Around that, there are also, I think my colleagues may be more um, averse with this, but around that you may have dual use areas, rights of way, um, um, waterway areas, which you also have to take account of, and it's not just the facility itself. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, as with any facility, you're looking at the ability of it to produce. So there needs to be some form of connection arrangement. One is how to generate, and we've kind of discussed the build, the planning. The other is how to generate, and then what is the mechanism to transfer that energy generated to where it has to go? Is it directly into the grid? In which case there needs to be some form of grid connection, and is that, depending where the facility is that partly onshore, partly offshore? So the production and distribution arrangements are also the second dimension in terms of ensuring you have the various permits and licenses in place. The other one refers to, I guess, connected to the first one, but we refer to it as surface area agreements or right of way agreements. And this is also connected a little bit to uh, uh, how long the facility will be there and how will you manage them, and what will happen after facility use, which we'll go into later. Um, Finally, and I think this one is really the most important, and it is maybe more connected to what Ava was discussing. That is your ESIA, your environmental and social impact assessment, because that really does encapsulate a lot of the other permits and licenses and other factors that need to be taken into account, and especially from an environmental perspective. So you're not just dealing with land, uh, you're dealing with a pool of water, and depending on the type of water, um, you may have a certain type of wildlife there, which for which there could be impacts, both uh, sort of animal, aquatic wildlife, or fauna, or other sorts of things. So um, your ESIA in this case, I think, um, has to have a really central focus, because a lot of the other things are very similar to and synonymous with land-based developments. You can take a lot of the principles from there, but I think it's your environmental uh, permitting approach, and that will fall. Those requirements will fall out of your ESIA. Um, and to cap that off, I know I've given very general principles, but if somebody was to ask, well, what's included, um, I I would say that we do reference the uh, National Environmental Policy Act in the US as a corpus of reference, starting point, and also this environmental directive. I can't remember the EC number, but there's an environmental directive in the EU as a starting point in terms of what is required under such an assessment. So given that there are X hundred countries in the world, and within those countries there are regions and localized, the multiplication of what you actually need, it can be very different. But what I hope I've given is a broad brush way of thinking about it, and some overarching dimensions on which areas need to be focused upon in order to manage all the permitting and licensing risks associated with a floating solar facility.
Thank you, Mohammed. I think one of the things Siddharth and I, when we initially was speaking about the session, or I was convincing him to join as a panelist, one of the things that we were speaking about was exactly this: that unlike land-based projects, for floating solar, there are so many variables with just the area where it's going to be set up. It could be a lake, reservoir, lagoon. It could have, the depth varies, the current varies. There's so many different aspects that are involved in a floating solar project. But actually, when you talk about having a regime for permitting license, that is, you, I mean, it rather, let me put it this way, that it makes sense to say that, okay, there has to be a unique permitting and licensing approach that every country needs to adopt. But the general guidelines that, you spoke about, I think give an view or a bird's eye view of what are the specific areas they would need to address when they talk about, or when they're looking at setting up their permitting and licensing procedures. So that's I think that is the starting approach that every country may need to look at when they're looking at setting up procedures and permitting processes. um,
Absolutely. If I can just quickly add, with these new technology type of projects and first of a kind type of projects, what you find is, as a developer or as an investor, or even on the side of the finance, if you have uh, equity finance and debt finance involved. You're really at times you're almost creating the industry. We've done this many times with many first of a kind projects. So it does take um, a partnership approach to developing these projects, and I would say that uh, as the industry expands, taking case studies like Indonesia or other areas, recommended practices, what I've mentioned, what Abe has mentioned, I think is a really good starting point. But at the same time, I think working with the national and local governments to um, really coordinate. It's not just about. I'll conclude with this. It's not just about, well, what should the regime be and what are all the licenses that are required, etc. I think a lot of it is stakeholder engagement. It's at times identifying who are the key stakeholders there and making sure that the risks, concerns, cost/benefits of all the stakeholders impacted are are met. And that may mean on the spot with your partners mapping of who to include. As we said, if the reservoir or the pool of water is within a utility, well, clearly you have to engage with the utility. If it's within an industrial zone, right? You know that, okay, as well as others, you need to engage with the industrial zone. So yeah. So in summary, stakeholder engagement, I think, is extremely important, especially in a new market or new industry setup.
Yes, thank you, Mohammed. I think then I'd like to ask Eva to maybe bring in the European perspective here. When Mohammed talked about engaging with the stakeholders and engaging with the stakeholders and identifying ways that the partnership could actually lead to scaling of projects. Maybe if you could if you could tell us what do you think could be the role of regulations or what could be the regulatory measures that could be used to enhance the bankability and investment friendliness of solar projects. Um, um, yeah.
I have, maybe two insights on this. I am a French law expert, so I will share about sometimes we think that I work in France. And I think in environmental law side, we are quite good at it. We have a long history in environmental regulation. And as Amarenco developed a floating PV in France, we were under the same law as ground-mounted PV and mentioned the environmental impact assessment, which is mandatory for every kind of big project under 1 megawatt, ground-mounted and floating on water. So environmental assessment means that you have an environmental study specifically on what Mohamed just focused, the environmental area, including social also and stakeholders, with recommendations specifically to the project in its local context. And then this assessment is followed by the impact study. And the impact study is a very well settled procedure where you have consultation, public consultation during that process. Sometimes people, we find it a bit too long because instead of being a 6 months permit, it's a 1.5 year permit. But maybe this would be controlled and checked, deep study on the. But at least at the end, you had public consultation. It was transparent procedure. Publication of the decision, etc. So when the project, it takes time, but when the project get out, it's set and it has been duly developed. So I think that's a good example. And I don't know for the globally, but in Europe, not all the country are so strict in procedure and in involving local community and having transparency and tackling so specifically the local condition on environment and social. And second thing I wanted to say why I'm taking this example, it's relating to investors. I think we might be very clever and very inventive in technology, but my opinion is we should not regarding regulatory framework because what investors like is stability, is certainty, um, and they like to know the rule because it's bringing so much security to the development of the project. And no, I was a bit fighting about the legislative volatility, excitation to find new idea, best idea, and I don't think this is a good solution. I think we have good example of permitting procedure, of regulatory framework that work. You just need to adapt a bit to local condition because each country has its culture, each continent also. So slightly adapted, but the most it's common, the most is stable, the most it will be attractive for investors. Wanted to say.
Absolutely. I think, Eva, you've touched upon the right points, and that we've seen this not only in floating solar, but even other solar technologies that, when we look at supporting countries with a lot of times, our developers will say that, we need certainty, regulatory certainty, especially like, I mean, if I was to give the example of, say, mini grids, um, certainty about what happens when the grid reaches that particular location becomes essential for a developer to develop a project, and that can be a make or break sometimes in certain places as well. And I think I'd move to a developer to talk about, like, what do you think could be the regulations that are required to actually scale or incentivize floating solar so that more and more investments come in to this technology?
So I think there are two aspects to this. One, of course, is it goes back to size of installations. As you've seen through the history of floating solar, however short they may be, we've seen the projects increase in size from installations that were a few kilowatts to a few megawatts. Now we are looking at installations largely in excess of 100 megawatts. So uh, the surface area that can be covered, the size of water bodies that you can look at, all become a factor, a growth factor as well as a constraint at that point in time. So economies of scale, I think you projects can absorb uh, a lot of uh, in an environment where regulations and standardization is still happening. Larger projects have a higher ability to withstand more stringent conditions being put. At the end of the day, plants are not an objective of putting a plant is not only to generate electricity but eventually sell it to the common person, common man. For it to be able to sold to them, it has to be cost effective. And when I say cost effective, I don't mean it on what returns a developer makes, right? Those returns are fairly standardized within a certain range depending on country and so on. However, the price we sell electricity at eventually translate into the price that the grid sells the electricity at. So I think that balance, the larger plants give you a slightly higher ability to have that balance. Uh, the second, as Mohammed pointed out, today as more and more installations happen, there is more. It's a clearer. There's more clarity on what developers need to do. It's not just the technical aspects of it. permitting, for example. I mean, a very simple example: every solar installation, especially ground mounted, is typically governed by a building code. Now, a floating installation, it's anchored to the ground, but for Chirata example, there's a 100-meter depth. Do you still govern the building code? If so, do you do it for one floor installation, or do you do it equivalent to 100? I mean, honestly, these were some of the questions that were discussed when we did the Chirata floating solar project. It was on a dam. You needed additional approvals from the dam commissions. And where should the plant be? What's the uh, what's the right word? Where do you have the overspill on the dam? Where do you have access to more community? Is it a restricted area within a dam? What other activities the dam is using? So these are all the aspects that go in. Although difficult to standardize it for every installation, but the evolution that ground mounted solar has had, I think floating solar is going through that evolution at this stage. As a developer, it helps us if we know what we have to do and the time it is going to take. It's far easier to say, you need this permit, you need to submit as a design. We've not even given an NTP to the EPC contractor. How do we give a design? Are you going to hold us to that design? What if I want to change my supplier? What if my module supplier has told me I cannot supply on those dates? Do I need to go and redesign and reapply a permit? My lenders are going to crucify me, right? Look, and my investors. I'm going to have a delay on my project. I'm going to pay penalties to the off taker. So I think this is an evolution that has to happen. It's very easy for me to get up and say, yes, I need an answer to every question beforehand. The reality is you don't. It's an iterative process. We've done one. Now we know in Indonesia when we do the next one, what learnings we'll have, what things we need to take care of. If we expand that to any of its neighboring countries, today we know what questions to ask. And I think that's the real sustainable part of it. It's the iterative growth, be it from our perspective or the lender's perspective or the regulations perspective from equipment or environment side.
I think you've what you I think this is where demonstration or pilot projects become important. So I come from a purely law background, and we believe that everything should have regulations before you even step a foot into it, and that can sometimes be a little cockeyed because, like you said, when you're actually on ground, that's when you recognize, oh wait, what happens? Do building codes apply or not? That's something maybe as a regulator who doesn't understand the technicalities of it may not actually think about when we are looking at regulation. So I think the idea of actually having these projects on ground and learning from them and developing regulations becomes crucial. And I think I'd move to Dr. Mauro and I want to maybe I mean we just had this conversation before the panel discussion started, and you were talking about how there should be standards before you actually implement a project. So I'm just curious if Siddharth has been able to maybe convince you that you have to have both in tandem, if not one after the other, or and how do you think standards, or when do you think standards need to come in after what Siddharth said?
Well, ideally, standards should be available before, but that's something which is not happening in the solar industry, I must say. And that again goes back to the comment on Professor Francesco speech at the beginning, which we need to act fast. Lucky enough, the industry is really adding fast, acting fast. So I want to give a couple of examples of standards that we are now working on to facilitate the takeover and of course to facilitate the work of Mazda, for example, or other or developers. Um, so when we put modules, I mean there are conventional applications and non-conventional applications, right? Now I treat floating solar as a non-conventional application because the history of installation on land or on buildings it's quite strong, and the qualification standard and the safety standard at the module level, and they are equivalent at system level, are all designed at the moment having in mind these kind of applications. Now, when we put modules on water and other examples that are still reality, but maybe require another panel, hopefully not necessarily another COP, but it will be if you put module on vehicles, if you put modules on buildings, the so-called building integration photovoltaics, agrivoltaics, you definitely have heard about that. So all these are different environments. When you change the environmental conditions, that's rather obvious, change. So when Master buys modules. Of course, they look at the certification of these modules and they say, okay, this module is qualified, is safe because it's passed these standards, so I'm fine. And I bring this in Indonesia and they install on water. Well, the critical part is that I believe you have asked your module manufacturers about floating shortly, but the critical part is that the certification standard at the at the moment available at module level, so the qualification and safety standards, have not been designed for for modules that go on water. So what is different in the water environment for respect to the so-called conventional environment? Well, the water moves. So here we're talking about modules that are supposed to move for all the entire life. Of course, it's a wet environment. And when we go talking about offshore floating, it's a corrosive environment. Now, offshore floating is something that surely Mazda is looking at, but at the moment, the installation at Sirata is not offshore, so it's non-corrosive environment. And there is already a mature standard on corrosive environment that at least the manufacturer can look at, and Mazda can call the manufacturer and say, hey, look, I want to install modules on the Gulf. Gulf is salty water. Can you please provide me modules that are robust to withstand 25 years or so in salty environment? So there is already a regulation about that. Uh, but while there are missing regulation at the moment, and we are working on that to take into account the other factors which I mentioned. For example, the moving environment, so vibration, torque, all these set of mechanical stresses that at the moment we are not we are not stressing the module on this. If you want examples of what we are stressing modules in my laboratory and in testing laboratories for example, is snow load. Now, snow load is a critical mechanical stress, and when you buy a module which is qualified, it can withstand a certain amount of snow, which is popular in many countries in the region. But of course, floating has a different mechanical stress, and we need to design a specific stress test that ensures Mazda and the buyer and Indonesian community, to give the example, of course, that this module will withstand whichever conditions they find in the maritime environment. So I mentioned about salty environment that of course refers to offshore. It can be salty plus industrial, as the colleague from DNV has mentioned. So that has another possibly corrosive effect. I think it has been mentioned in Eva's presentation, which is also well known for floating PV developers, the importance of the fauna there. You know, when you install in certain lands, these lands, there are owners of these lands. There are not only the community, but is also the bird community, right? So nature is somehow also owning that land, and we need to be sure that, and I mean, believe me, we saw in Singapore with otters that are not birds, but birds and otters love floating systems because they are warm, they are drier than water, and they really love to go there. And of course, this gives some impact on the module performance, right? So we need to be sure that with this kind of nexus, which is not only water and sun, but is also sun and nature, module is still reliable and and robust food to last for many years. So corrosive environment, mechanical environment with mechanical stress, and of course the water. So water module, as we all know, are supposed to stay under the sun, and under the sun means that when it rains is also under rain. Side note, I've recently, actually last year, made a presentation in the World Conference in Milan, which showed the result of of performance of a system that was installed for 10 years in Singapore, and the system was dramatically failing because 10 years ago module manufacturers were shorting a certain materials, and they have to try new materials. And one particular materials that this manufacturer, which of course I cannot give the name anyway, he exited the market for solar for some time, so there will be no effect anyway. But okay, this material was very bad, and they actually did not achieve the 25 years that was under the warranty. Now, what the owner would do about that, or the developer? I mean, the owner would call the developer, and the developer, what does he do? I mean, there's a warranty. You look at the warranty. The warranty was saying that warranty doesn't cover for particular environmental condition. For example, irradiance, rain. I mean, of course, this is I mean, you are the lawyer, right? Okay, this is something that is unacceptable. Clearly, the module need to withstand the presence of the sun, right? And the presence of rain. Now, here, assuming that this is granted with new modules, right? Here, there's another impact, which is the waves, right? And the impact of wave in certain conditions, if not in all conditions, can give a new phenomenon which is not tested, for which the module at the moment is not tested, which is the thermal shock. module is at 50 or maybe 60 degrees Celsius, depending on the condition, maybe a little bit lower if it's on water, right? Anyway, this is the standard operation temperature, let's say 50 or whatever degrees Celsius. And then splash of water, which is naturally somewhere, I don't know, can be 5, it can be maybe a little bit warmer in certain areas, but still it's colder. And suddenly the module, in a very short amount of time, drops temperature in this way. Are we sure that the material can really withstand this kind of thermal stress? Most likely, yes. But this test is not at the moment performed when qualifying modules. So these are few examples of things that we are now trying to implement at the qualification standard that will be specific for floating. And we hope that this will definitely help the further development and of these kind of systems, and making both Mazda and the local community happy for what they are doing, and again to reach the goals that we are all trying to achieve.
Thank you, Dr. Mauro. I think I think some lawyer did a brilliant job by just including the sun and the rain, and that's why it's important to read the fine print. The terms and conditions are there for a reason, probably not in your favor. So that's just a lawyer's note to you. So I think one of the key things that we spoke about, and everybody who spoke here spoke a lot about the environmental impact that floating solar can create. And of course, it's too premature, and floating solar is too young to actually see where and how it will impact the environment. But one of the key things we could look at, or one of the key things that maybe Mohammed, you could highlight, was regarding the decommissioning of floating solar projects. If you could just shed some light on, how can we ensure that um, when these projects are decommissioned, the impact on the environment is as little as possible.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's going to be a very short answer. Essentially, I think the decommissioning of panels is quite is quite common to whether it's ground mounted or whether it's floating. But so what I can do is reiterate what we need to look at and at what stage. So going back to the principles that I mentioned, in obtaining your building permits or your planning permission, having undertaken a complete environmental social impact assessment, by design, by process, you will have had to take an account of decommissioning issues and a decommissioning plan included in all of that assessment before you get, in general, before you get the license or the planning permission to go ahead. So, and what you're trying to achieve is, I mean, again, I'm not a legal expert, but sort of restoration of the area to its original kind of state. Um, so, in general, I think first and foremost, um, the whole process of decommissioning, you look at that at the beginning and not the end. There's already a plan in place. There's already I mean, even in your financial models, you have to take account of, there's a reserve account which you have for decommissioning costs. The second is um, obviously when with respect to the natural habitat, whether you're installing or whether you're taking out, the logistics, the process, whether you fixed it to the ground and when you're gonna in the waterbed or whatever, and you start to um, take the bolts out or whatever, and there are sort of uh, procedures for care there. But I think the biggest factor you've got to look at, especially in this day and age, within a kind of an ESG framework, um, is number one, what does it take to put everything in? I mean, what is the social footprint, carbon footprint, environmental footprint of installing it in the first place and getting it there, etc. Because I think that goes into the thinking, part of your thinking for decommissioning. Second, right from the outset, we need to be looking at how we are going to dispose of the material, and obviously, what sort of impact is it? Actually, I should have said this first. What sort of impact is it going to have to remove the facility? Um, as our colleague mentioned in the earlier discussion, if birds or otters or whatever and have adapted to this new environment, what's going to happen when you kind of disassemble everything? So I think that life cycle approach needs to be taken into account. And the final thing, which I got the wrong way around, but now it's final, the right way around, um, is we already need to have taken account of the entire carbon footprint life cycle and how those panels will be and those structures will be disposed of, and ideally recycled, repurposed, reused. So I think those are the factors that do go into looking at the decommissioning approach. But you have to think of the decommissioning, even though it's 20, 25 years away, you do have to think of that at the beginning.
Thank you, Mohammed. I mean, of course, this discussion you just brought up ESG, which is, um, I mean, a lawyer's sweet point where we'd like to talk a lot about it, but due to the paucity of time, we'll probably have to close this session. But before we do, if there are any questions that are from the audience, for any of the panelists, you could just let them know who you'd like the answer from, and please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sanana. First of all, thank you very much. It was a very qualitative discussion, and we have understood, the basic nitty-gritties about how the standardization is need to be done. My question is related to both with Dr. Mauro as well as Siddharth. Based on the experience that you have, if you see the Indian pretext as well as the areas when we have to achieve the economies of scale, reduce the tariff, then for the based on the execution of the project, we require to install higher modules, number of modules with higher number of rating. It can be 540, it can be 600, so that the land area, as well as when we talk about the floating area, so to reduce the area requirement, we increase the size of the modules. Now, keeping the, when we talk about floating solar projects, we have to consider, like Mr. Mauri said, that all the necessary nitty-gritties about what will be the, the waves type of a mechanism, what will be the offshore mechanism in which there will be the corrosion. What is your experience that with reference to increase in the size of the project, how we have to consider the sizing of the modules? Along with that, whether it is making the financial sense to increase it for the reduction of the area and then execute the project accordingly without compromising on the IRR for the developer's perspective. This is one of the questions that I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Um, I think size of the module is first a design question. Then comes the EPC part of it, as in what's the cost to make it. I think IRR is the last element and is just an output of both of them. However, it does have an impact. I mean, a higher watt peak module can be a function of two things. Uh, Until about 2 years ago is when the second element was introduced. Originally, an increased watt peak was a result of higher efficiency, and I, I'll s- I'll be very basic in my statement. I technically beyond a point. Even if I say something which is inaccurate, pardon me. So the first set of increase happened as a result of higher efficiency. The second increase happened by simply increasing the size of the module. When the first time the module size increased, if I give an example of ground mounted solar, especially in this part of the world where you have trackers, the tracker manufacturers had to adapt their their base offering, because the length of each tracking table had to increase to accommodate the bigger module. That actually resulted in a higher cost. So there was, in the first instance, the preference was to go to a smaller size module, right? However, if I think on a floating solar there may be a, a bit more flexibility, because each float is designed for at this stage, at this point in time, at least for a particular installation. So you may have a bit more leeway. Uh, it may also allow you to have greater distance between each floating island, to ensure that the local flora, fauna, the environment, the fishes, birds, etc., have uh, a mix of, and or rather, we don't change their base environment a whole lot. Uh, so the short answer is it depends. Uh, but as long as efficiency is increasing, why not?
Yeah, I had my comment on this. I totally agree. I mean, in in the last whatever 10 years, we have observed first that an important increase in efficiency that now tend to stabilize, and and that was due made mostly to the introduction in the market to the PERC module. Now with the TopCon and heterojunction, there's also a slight high increase in efficiency. But while 10 years ago a module of 20% was considered, very high efficiency, now 20% is pretty much what you find everywhere, and you cannot find anywhere which is lower than 18%. Talking about silicon, of course. So now it became different, and now, of course, the module increase in power simply because they are bigger. Also, this is going to stabilize. I believe the module manufacturers are now kind of agree on a so-called golden standard in terms of size, which is about 2.3 meter long and 1 point something meter wide, and they are not going to grow more than that. So they may be again back with in the next years a little bit to grow again in efficiency, but that would be the standard. Also, when you put the modules on floating, you don't necessarily uh, well, you look at robustness, right? So probably you choose the technology that is better suited to an environment which is extremely humid. So and yeah, and due to the size, you normally don't necessarily take the most efficient one, which is also the most expensive one. But I want to finally comment back again on the robustness, which is should be really the driving decision making point, because if I may suggest to the developers, when they really approach module manufacturers, first of all, be sure what you buy. Modules are becoming more and more technologically complex, so even more technologically difficult to measure. And sometimes there's no surprise that the module have an overrating of or significant overrated.
Right.
And that is, I believe, mostly because it's so difficult to measure that sometimes it's, even too difficult to measure from the calibration laboratory that calibrated all the module for that particular manufacturer. So if in terms of investment you want to be sure what you buy, you really have to be take care of what you buy, and maybe send this module to be tested by more than one verification lab, so that you are sure what you buy. And then for the concern about the robustness, that's definitely, I mean, we need standards, so we need to be sure that the module can withstand this kind of new environmental conditions. That would be the critical part. But it's so important that this is already happening, because again, back to the problem at the beginning, if we were waiting, and if I had to convince Mazda, please try to install on water, because otherwise we have no story. Lucky enough, I didn't have to. They are already doing it, so I will benefit knowing from what happens if there is. We hope not. Cross fingers that installing on floating on reservoir is not that critical for the durability of the module. So that's of course the hope, and we trust it, because anyway, by the way, don't want to pass a wrong message. Module manufacturers are already doing their internal stress test. Otherwise, they would be insane to buy a big amount of, invest a big amount of money on something that never see water. So module manufacturers, they're doing their own thing. What is missing is an international agreement. So if you, how can Mazda decide whether to buy module manufacturer number one or module manufacturer number two? I mean, they cannot be compared because they do different module stress test. So just to trust. Maybe they go, they see what they do, they check the reputation of if it's tier one or not, these kind of things. And then, if, of course, you look at the cost as well. And it will be much better when we have, when we have embedded a standard process so that you can easily compare. Uh, we are not that yet. And I mean, your question about the development of modules is important because it brings me the opportunity to mention that really the modules of 10 to 20 years ago was different. Still silicon, but completely different of what you buy now. And that is certainly an improvement for certain perspective, but also certainly for other perspective, a little bit of a risk because materials have completely changed. Thinner frames, different, and whatever. So that all comes with new challenges for the industry, but also for testing laboratories to make sure that these, products follow enough, robust standards to be deployed.
Sorry, just one point to add to that. This is one place where standardization helps. I
Right.
mean, a module may need to be changed during the life of the project for whatever reason, hotspot, damage. I mean, imagine if the new module of a similar capacity is of a different size. You cannot put it on the same float or a same structure. So I think this is where that standardization is extremely helpful. Yeah, there are different technical challenges, more efficient modules, more power, cabling, and design, but at least you can put a module there if you need to. So I think this is one of those examples where it's extremely important to have the regulation and the standardization in place.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you, Dr. Mauro. I think we have kind of overshot our time, and um, that is, I think, evidence of how good this discussion has been. Thank you so much to online panelists as well, Eva and Mohammed, for joining in, and Dr. Mauro and Siddharth as well. Of course, special shout out to Dr. Francisco Sindico as well, who had to go for another session, so who couldn't be with us. Um, I think the conversations today, we are hoping that these discussions actually, the outcome of this would be that a better understanding of the challenges. And when we go to countries and we talk about, say, floating solar, we'll use these examples and use these, um, you know, uh, examples and learnings that you have provided to us to maybe help countries develop regulatory frameworks for floating solar. So thank you so much for joining us. The recorded session of this, the recording of this session and the technical session is available on our YouTube channel in case somebody would like to go back and see the session, especially the technical one, because I'm not sure if you would have had the chance to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Slide.
Thank you.
Thank you.